What's up, everybody? Thank you for being here, and I assure you that this will be invigorating. So even though we're going over time, it won't feel that way, I assure you. So as he said, my name is Jason Silva, and I'm a media artist. I'm interested in inspiration, I'm interested in awe, and I'm interested in celebrating the power of human imagination. A year and a half ago, I left my job working for Al Gore's TV channel, Current TV, and I decided to create my own content. I made a series of short films that I call Shots of Philosophical Espresso. They are 2-minute micro documentaries whose function is to pull you so radically out of context that you are forced to gawk in amazement at the ubiquitous everyday wonders that you're culturally disposed to ignore. Because I think that it's when you awaken the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and the film of familiarity and redirecting it instead to the wonders of existence, that's when we really come alive. Now, I'm particularly interested in creating narratives that have to do with optimism. I find optimism sort of reassuring. I find it to be an existential antidote to despair. You know, the human condition is defined by our fear of mortality. It's defined by our limitations. And I think that creativity and technology is the way that we transcend our limitations. It's the way that we transcend our boundaries. What it is to be human is to go beyond all previous limits. We didn't stay in the caves, we haven't stayed on the planet, and pretty soon we won't stay with the limitations of our biology. And one of the things that my films explore is the role of technology as a scaffolding. Andy Clark, the cognitive philosopher, refers to technology as our exoskeleton. He says it's a scaffolding that extends our thought, our reach, and our vision. And I think this narrative of technology is a really interesting thing, to think of it as our extended phenotype, to think of it as an outgrowth of the human mind, as the imagination made manifest. As Terence McKenna says, we live inside of condensations of our imagination. Having said that, we live in a world that is now global and exponential, but we still have these brains that evolved in a world that was linear and local. And so our brains don't really understand the exponential progress that we're making with technology. One of the best examples that Ray Kurzweil uses to explain exponential growth is the 30 steps example. He says if you take 30 linear steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 30 steps later, you're at 30. That's the way our linear brains interpret the world. That's how we interpret progress. That's how we make projections. If you take those same 30 steps exponentially, same amount of steps, you go 2, 4, 8, 16, 30 steps later, you're actually at 1 billion. Now that's the reason that the smartphone that's in your pocket, that's tethered to you, that's the reason that your extended mind is 1 million times cheaper, 1 million times smaller, and 1,000 times more powerful than a $60 million supercomputer that was half a building in size 40 years ago in Stanford. That kind of progress that we've made in 40 years, the fact that a young person in Africa today with a smartphone has better communications technology than the US president had 25 years ago is a testament to the progress that we are making. Bill Clinton recently wrote an article in Time magazine called A Case for Optimism, and he says, forget about the info-haves and the info-nots. This divide is a myth. And he cited a United Nations study from 2010 that found that the cell phone is one of the greatest inventions in history to help pull people out of poverty. Now, what do these things do? Amber Case, the cyborg anthropologist, says that our cell phones embody us, give us technologically enabled telepathy. They allow us to send our thoughts through time and space, transcending time, space, and distance. Mind-to-mind communication is now real. If the Vitruvian Man, if Leonardo's Vitruvian Man was painted today, he would have probably a smartphone in his hand, and you'd have a little diagram that would point to his opposable thumb, his neocortex, his frontal lobe, and his extended mind. We need to get over the idea of what's called the skin bag bias that says that there's a separation between us and our tools, because in reality, our intelligence is distributed. The human mind is distributed in the feedback loops between brains, tools, and their environments. And these tools are getting exponentially more powerful. I find this to be a mind fuck. And so what I decided to do is make these videos to try to communicate that inspiration, to communicate that awe, and invigorate audiences to think about technology in a different way, and to sort of have a new narrative about what it means to be human in this ongoing human-technology coevolution. So the first video that I want to show you is about the power of ideas to transform the world. This video premiered at the TED Global Conference, and hopefully it'll invigorate you. Let's watch your first video.
You know, I love this idea of radical openness, the free exchange of information, the free flow of ideas, creating spaces in which ideas can have sex, as Matt Ridley talks about. And this is huge because it turns out that ideas are just as real as the neurons they inhabit, as James Gleick tells us. You know, a new kingdom rises above the biosphere. Denizens of this kingdom are ideas, because ideas have retained some of the properties of organisms, it turns out. They leap from brain to brain. They compete for the limited resources of our attention. They have infectivity. They have spreading power. They are what Richard Dawkins calls the new replicators, born from the primordial soup of human culture. Their vector of transmission is language and electronic communications. And though ideas are not made of nucleic acid, they have achieved more evolutionary change, and at a rate that leaves the old gene panting far behind. You know, Ray Kurzweil says our ability to create virtual models in our heads, combined with our modest-looking thumbs, was sufficient to usher in a secondary force of evolution called technology. And it will continue until the entire universe is at our fingertips. This is unbelievable stuff. It speaks to the telescoping nature of evolutionary change. More change in the last 100 years than in the last billion years. Terence McKenna actually wrote that from the moment that human beings invented language, biological evolution essentially ceased, and evolution became a cultural epigenetic phenomenon. Now, we take in matter of low organization, we put it through our mental filters, and we extrude it in the form of space shuttles and iPhones. You know, the imaginary foundation tells us that what imagination does is it allows us to conceive of delightful future possibilities, pick the most amazing one, and pull the present forward to meet it. You know, imagine how impoverished this world would have been if we hadn't invented the technology of the oil painting in time for Van Gogh, or the technology of the musical instrument in time for Beethoven and Mozart to unfurl through it. You know, with the revolutions in biotechnology, nanotechnology, the free exchange of information is allowing us to conceive of radical new things. Freeman Dyson says, in the future, new generation of artists will be writing genomes with the fluency that Blake and Byron wrote verses. What is great in man, said Nietzsche, is that he is a bridge and not an end. You know, we're on a trajectory smack in the middle between the born and the made, wrote Kevin Kelly. And so radical openness, it's huge. It's a universe of possibility. It's gray infused by color. It's the invisible revealed. It's the mundane blown away by awe. We need to cultivate radical openness as a way of participating and accelerating evolution. Wow.
You know, thank you so much. One of my favorite ideas that's explored in that is that notion that Kevin Kelly says, that we don't think of technology this way normally, but think how impoverished this world would have been if the instrument hadn't been invented in time for Beethoven, or if the alphabet hadn't been invented in time for Shakespeare. So what new forms of human creativity will unfurl through new technologies that are coming online? Freeman Dyson, the physicist, he talks about writing genomes, the way that poets used to write verses. When the canvas of life itself becomes the new instrument for human creativity, what are we going to make? I mean, you have these overlapping revolutions. You have artificial intelligence, you have biotechnology, you have nanotechnology. With biotechnology, we are going to be mastering the information processes of biology. Now, what that means is we'll be able to upgrade our biological software the way we upgrade our iOS. I mean, at least we have this on backup, but right now we don't back up our brains. We don't back up the information mind file that constitutes who we are. But like, imagine a world where we can upgrade ourselves. We can be enlarged by our tools. And increasingly, these tools will become microscopic, because just the same way as we went from the supercomputer into the smartphone, eventually these things will go inside of our bodies, reverse engineering us from inside. I mean, increasingly, we are more and more, it just blows my mind. I get so excited. The next video I want to show you is a sort of living and breathing example of how the human mind can shape reality, and it's not like a New Age bumper sticker, but rather it's inspired by David Deutsch's new book, The Beginning of Infinity. And I was really turned on when I saw that, when I read that book, and particularly the New York Times review of the book that cited this specific example about the human capacity to basically shape matter and trump geology. And I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but because we're pressed for time, let's play that video and you'll see why the human mind has trumped geology.
2, 1, 0.
I am very much an optimist. I'm reminded of Rich Doyle's line from Darwin's Pharmacy. He says, "Dreams do not lack reality. They are real patterns of information. Or when the Imaginary Foundation says that the role of human imagination is to conceive of all these delightful futures, choose the most amazing and exciting and ecstatic possibility, and then pull the present forward to meet it. That is what we do. We bring our imaginings into existence. But I think that as technology has advanced, we have found ways to outsource our mental capacities to our tools so much more. Our ability to manipulate the physical world has increased in an exponential fashion. So we've been able to shrink the lag time between our imaginings and their instantiation in the real world. David Deutsch speaks in his new book, The Beginning of Infinity. He says, if you look at the topography of the island of Manhattan today, that topography is a topography in which the forces of economics and culture and human intent have trumped the forces of geology. I mean, the topography of Manhattan today is no longer shaped by mere geology. It's shaped by the human mind and by economics and by culture. And so what David Deutsch extrapolates is that ultimately that will be the fate of the whole universe. He says gravitation and antimatter might only shape the universe at its earliest and least interesting stages, but eventually the whole entire thing will be subject to the intent of substrate-independent, infinitely more powerful minds. And to conceive of that just, it makes me feel ecstatic.
And you know, that word ecstasy is very true. I read an article recently talking about shamans as the ecstatic technicians of the sacred. I mean, these are people that are able to take your mind to places you didn't know can go and experience things you didn't know could experience. And I think that inspiration can be that. There's this sort of, I tell people these videos are souvenirs from the ecstatic state. I've always found that inspiration can be so fleeting. It's sort of defined by its impermanence. It's a moment in which the dots are connected and just as quickly the moment is gone. And if you don't have a pen and if you didn't write it down, it's over. And part of my attempt with these videos was to see if I could immortalize inspiration, if I could truly hold it in some kind of stasis, which I think is the goal of any artist. There's this kind of angst whenever we experience an epiphany. It's like, how can I communicate this epiphany to somebody else? How can I put them in my head? Because inspiration can be quite lonely. And I think that the artist, through song or through paint, in any kind of artistry, is really an attempt to put people inside of our subjective state and share that, to have the compassion to share that experience that sort of blurs the separation that makes us feel like we're isolated from one another. So I think I'm out of time. So I had two more videos to show, but I want to skip one of them and go to the last one, which is about the power of awe. And it's inspired by a Stanford study recently that found that pulling ourselves out of context and pushing our perceptual boundaries beyond their usual limitations is not just wonderfully uplifting, but actually leaves us with profound psychological benefits. So here's the biological advantage of being awestruck. The very last video, please.
Eminent psychologist Nicholas Humphrey has written of the biological advantage of being awestruck. How fortuitous, he says, for a species to find that its own ability to contemplate, to marvel at its own existence, has been evolutionarily advantageous. In other words, it has been biologically selected for because it informs our life with a sense of cosmic significance that makes us work harder to persist and to survive. In other words, awe has helped us survive. And you know, a recent study out of Stanford on the subject of awe kind of validates this idea. They have found that regular incidences of awe leave residual benefits upon the individual that persist, such as increased feelings of empathy and compassion towards others, increased feelings of altruism, and increased feelings of general well-being. In this study, they defined awe as an experience of such perceptual expansion, such perceptual vastness, that you literally have to reconfigure, upgrade your mental schemata just to accommodate, just to take in the scale of the experience. This is amazing. We've all felt this before. The first time we stared upon the Grand Canyon or succumbed to the immersive power of an IMAX film. But perhaps the most exquisite account of the experience of awe was articulated by the brilliant Ross Anderson when writing about the Hubble Space Telescope. Pay attention. He says that the Hubble has given us nothing less than an ontological awakening, a forceful reckoning with what is, allowing us to contemplate space and time on a scale just shy of the infinite. Wild. He says gazing upon the famous deep field photograph literally allows us to mainline the whole of time through the optic nerve. To fit something so impossibly large to something so impossibly small. It's incredible. He says through the sheer aesthetic force of its discoveries, the Hubble distills the impossibly complex abstractions of astrophysics into these singular expressions of color and light, vindicating Keith's famous couplet, "Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty."
That was inspired by the power of the Hubble, but really it's a metaphor for the ability that technology serves as a sort of instrument of mind. You know, Timothy Leary came back in the 90s and he said that the computers are the new computers and technology extend our mind, extend our consciousness, and so I believe that's very true. Thanks very much for being here, and if you want to continue the conversation, these videos are non-commercial, but I'd love your thoughts. I'm at Jason Silva on Twitter. Thanks very much.
Thank you.